Victorian England prided itself on its like Protestant morals and ethics, right? And a lot of these opium smugglers, they themselves sponsor a lot of evangelical Christian missionaries to go into China to proselytize. And a lot of these missionaries, at the same time, they decry the predation brought by the opium trade, but at the same time, they're willing to take money from these opium merchants who sponsor their work. So but their justification is that yes, but we are saving souls, right? We're trading, we're giving them something, a value even greater. We're giving them the kingdom of God. We're just taking away their life on this earthly realm. We're giving them the door to the heaven. And this is how kind of the mental gymnastics the colonialists performed in order to justify their action. They knew it was wrong. All of them knew it was wrong, but they kind of jumped backwards to justify why this is all legit.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
One of the families that I think is very not really often mentioned when we talk about the Opium Wars and China is the Sassoon family. This is an image of the Sassoon family. By the way, I was talking to my girlfriend Ophelia earlier today, and we're kind of like, damn, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of look like I could be related to one of them. Like if I just wear the same outfit, I could probably be like one of their cousins. But anyway, this is the Sassoon family, commonly referred to as the Rothschilds of the East or the Rothschilds of China, because of the huge amount of money they made from finance and trade. The Sassoon family was originally based in Baghdad, Iraq, but they later relocated to Bombay, India, and then China. And this is exactly what Carl was talking about earlier, that India-China connection, where they grew a lot of the opium in India and then brought it to China to sell as a commodity, force and drug the population. So Sassoon Ben Salih, who was born 1750 and died 1830, was the patriarch, and he's the guy who's sitting down. He was the chief treasurer to the Ottoman leaders of Baghdad and southern Iraq during the Ottoman Empire. His sons David and Joseph, born 1792 and 1795, eventually left Iraq and moved to India and China, where the opium trade was growing heavily. And in 1832, David moved to Bombay, India with his family. In Bombay, he built the international drug money cartel called David S. Sassoon, staffing his company with other merchants of similar background from Baghdad, Iraq. And David established the family's leading role in the Sino-Indian opium trade. The family's businesses in China, Hong Kong, and Shanghai in particular, as Carl mentioned, very geopolitically strategic areas for China. If you control Hong Kong, if you control Shanghai, you control a large part of the country. They capitalized on this opium business that was controlled by the British. And Carl did a great job at setting up the context, right? These two opium wars, they were making money from this. They were making money from tons of millions of people being drugged and killed and murdered by the British imperialists, the Sassoon family. And Elias David, born 1820, his son by his first wife had been the first of the sons to go to China in 1844. He later returned to Bombay before leaving the firm to establish E.D. Sassoon and Co. And what's interesting is that one of the Sassoon family relatives settled in England, Sir Edward Albert Sassoon, who was born 1856. He married Aline Caroline de Rothschild, another banking family that made millions of dollars from the opium trade in China, lobbying the British government to continue to push, because that's one of the interesting things about the British presence in China at this time, that there were many wealthy banking cartels pushing the British government to continue its policies. We know of HSBC Bank being one of the banks that profited heavily. A lot of banking institutions, the wealth of Western imperialism that exists today would be impossible without the exploitation of China. And the Rothschild and the Sassoon families were definitely responsible for that. Another descendant of the Sassoon family, the guys you see right now on the screen, is the British banker and former Treasury's Commercial Secretary James Mayer Sassoon. He was mentioned in the Paradise Papers as one of the beneficiaries of a tax-exempt Cayman Island trust fund worth $236 million in 2007. And from the 18th century onward, the Sassoons were one of the wealthiest families in the world, with a corporate empire spanning the entire continent of Asia. What we're going to do is I'm going to play a clip. This is a clip, very interesting, man. This is Jonathan Kaufman, former China correspondent and author of The Last Kings of Shanghai. Very interesting book that talks about the Sassoon and the Kadoorie families in China and how they made millions of dollars from the opium trade. This is him talking about how the Sassoons made millions selling opium in China, and we'll discuss more about this.
Now, China at this point was still a closed country. It didn't want anyone coming in who did not have permission. Most of its cities were closed to foreigners. And the main reason for that was that the British firms were dealing in opium and smuggling opium into China. Opium was incredibly profitable. It's a very profitable business for these British firms. But the Chinese were very afraid of it. And about this time, about 12% of China's population was addicted to opium. Now, as a comparison, these days, about 2% of Americans struggle with opioid addiction. And we know the kind of pain and suffering that opioid addiction has caused in the United States and elsewhere. Well, imagine if it was 6 times as bad. This was the situation that China was facing. And so they really wanted to keep opium out of their country. But the British companies saw enormous profits could be made. And so they lobbied the British government to essentially go to war with China over opium. These were the opium wars of the late 1830s and early 1840s, when British gunboats sailed up into China, defeated the Chinese Empire, and demanded that China open up its cities for trade. Hong Kong, Shanghai, Guangzhou, all the great cities of China, so the British could trade opium and eventually other products. Well, David Sassoon looked at this and he realized there was an incredible business opportunity to be made. And he had 8 sons, and he essentially deployed his 8 sons across China to establish a beachhead for the family business. And the Sassoons became very successful in trading opium, in large part because they were technologically very innovative. I sometimes think of China at this time like the Silicon Valley of its time, where young men, they were always men, could go and make a fortune very quickly. The Sassoons decided to invest in steamships. And what that meant was that they could take the opium, which was grown in India, and get it to China faster than their British rivals who were using sailing ships. They were the first family to invest in the telegraph, and that allowed all the sons of David Sassoon to communicate with each other and to communicate with their father back in Bombay and discuss what was the price of opium doing? Should they bring the ships now? Should they wait until the price rose? And because of these innovations and this kind of entrepreneurial thinking, within about 10 or 15 years, the Sassoons were able to dominate the opium trade and to drive all their British rivals out of business. When I was working on the book, I was able to see the business records of many of the British companies who were dealing with the Sassoons, Jardine Matheson and others. And they were just kind of stunned by how swiftly the Sassoons were able to take over the opium trades. They kept on referring to these dirty Jews, where were they coming from, these hook-nosed traders. But the fact was, by 1860, 1870, the Sassoons essentially controlled the opium trade to China. And communists in 1949, when they were able to conquer China, they seized the Sassoon business records in Shanghai. And I was able to see them. And the Chinese concluded that the Sassoons probably made about $1 billion, B for billion, in profits from the opium trade. And that money then was kind of used to buy other property, build hotels, build factories, and so forth. I think the whole question of opium is a difficult one, because certainly as Jews, many of us feel that the idea of Jewish values is something that's going to influence all your life and your business decisions as well. And we like to think of Jewish businessmen as being perhaps more moral than others. And so I asked the Sassoon descendants today about the opium trade and about their feelings about it. And they pointed out quite rightly, opium was legal. It had been made legal after the Opium War. It was legal in Britain. It was legal in India. In fact, the British government taxed opium to help pay for the colonial government in India. One way the Sassoons became so influential is that they would entice members of the British aristocracy, including the Prince of Wales, to invest in opium as a way for them to make a quick profit as well. And so what the Sassoons would say to me is that, opium, it was like cigarettes or like alcohol. This was a vice, and, the Chinese wanted it. And so the Sassoons saw it as a business decision. And while that's true, I don't think it tells the whole story. The Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. They themselves never used opium. And in fact, while they were growing their opium trade, there were numerous efforts in London, the United States, and elsewhere to stop the opium trade. Doctors would mobilize to speak out against it. There would be campaigns to try to make the opium trade illegal. And when I went through the Sassoon business papers, they often are having to fire Chinese workers who had become, helpless because they were addicted to opium. So the Sassoons sort of knew what they were doing. And I think at some level, sadly, they sort of had a British or an imperial or a colonialist mindset, which is that the suffering this was causing the Chinese didn't matter as much to them as the profits did. There's a famous quote, I think it's from Balzac, who said, behind every great fortune, there's a great crime. And I think in the case of the Sassoons, that crime was opium.
Crazy stuff from Jonathan Kaufman. And by the way, I played the clip because he has some interesting information. That talk that he gave, he's the author of The Last Kings of Shanghai. He was giving a talk for some Zionist organization on YouTube or whatever. So he has a very different perspective. But it's interesting that he calls it entrepreneurial thinking, right? When you're fucking dealing drugs and enslaving millions of people. And he says they pointed out quite rightly that it was legal, and I think someone had a great comment, SCH Dow. It was legal because I bribed the government into making it legal. That's exactly right. And he compared it to cigarettes and alcohol. Carl, your reaction to all that?
They literally waged two wars, not one opium war, but two opium wars to make sure it's legal in China. And that's the whole reason the second opium war was even fought, because the British weren't satisfied. The opium trade wasn't completely legalizing all of China. So they had to go to Beijing and burn down the Summer Palace to quote unquote teach Chinese a lesson. And this is this is very similar to actually the prevailing sentiment among the Western colonialists at the time, because the Victorian England prided itself on its Protestant morals and ethics, right? And a lot of these opium smugglers, they themselves sponsor a lot of evangelical Christian missionaries to go into China to proselytize. And a lot of these missionaries, at the same time, they decry the depredation brought by the opium trade, but at the same time, they're willing to take money from these opium merchants who sponsor their work. But their justification is that, yes, but we are saving souls, right? We're trading, we're giving them something, a value even greater. We're giving them the kingdom of God. We're just taking away their life on this earthly realm. We're giving them the door to the heaven. And this is how kind of the mental gymnastics that the colonialists performed in order to justify their action. They knew it was wrong. All of them knew it was wrong, but they kind of jumped backwards to justify why this is all legit. And again, I think it's this kind of guilty conscience that really plays kind of the current modern projection when you say United States is talking about China. For example, in talking about the fentanyl and opioid crisis in China, like they are so scared that the Chinese would do to them what they had done to the Chinese people. So they had all these crazy projections onto the current China. And you know, as far as I know, China is not selling its aircraft carriers to California to demand United States, you know, take drugs as payment. Yeah, I mean, this just does not happen. And I do want to point out about the fentanyl crisis. The accusation against China is a chemical precursors that's used to as a component to make the fentanyl. It's produced by pharmaceutical companies in China, but they're produced as pharmaceuticals. It's these gangs who are importing these chemical precursors and then to synthesize them on American continent, whether in Mexico or in United States, and make them into fentanyl, right? And these are not state-sponsored, you know, state-sponsored operation the way the British East India Company was, or you know, there's not a fentanyl war imposed on the United States, you know, to make United States to accept the fentanyl as a legal, you know, to legalize fentanyl. Nothing of that ever happened. And so again, like there's a lot of guilty, and like some people pointed out in the comments too. America also profited from the opium trade because while British corner about 85% of the opium market in China, the Americans had about 15% of the opium market in China. And all the great New England old money families, like the Forbes family, from whom the John Forbes Carey descended, made their first gold in China. It's all these, Jonathan Kaufman talk about all these entrepreneurial young men making their fortune in China, right? This happened, like John FDR's grandfather, Warren Delano, John Forbes, all these young Americans, they traveled to China as teenagers. They came back in the early 20s, and they're quote unquote self-made millionaires, you know, by selling opium, you know, and that opium money actually seeded the industrialization effort in United States, because John Forbes created an investment bank in United States with his opium money proceedings. And he invested in railroads built from New York, extending to Chicago. So all the U.S. Western world expansion, industrialization, all got seeded with opium money, and all the great institutions of learning that we have today, Harvard, Yale, they're all funded by the opium money. So the opium money is very deeply entwined in America's past. It's something that very few Americans today even aware of it.